Okay, welcome to Hawaii Politics, Poli-Sci 180. I'm Umi Perkins, your instructor, and because this is the first video lecture that I'm doing, I thought I'd start by introducing myself, but we're going to talk today about this week's reading, what we call Hawaii State, the last 4 years of politics in Hawaii, 2014 to 2018. So, in Hawaiian way of introducing oneself, there's really two things that you focus on. You don't say, I'm an accountant, I'm a teacher. You would say, who is your family and where you're from. So, a kind of shorthand way for me to do that is just to talk about my mother. That's my Hawaiian side. Lealoha Apo Perkins is my mother, and she's from Lahaina, Maui. So that's where my family goes back to on that side of the family. She's a writer, and this is her in a group of Pacific Island writers. Her brother is a politician, so and she is an academic. She was a professor of English literature, and so I kind of blended the two. My uncle's Peter Apo. He is a current trustee of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs and a former state representative. He was assistant to the governor, so he had a long career in politics. And so I kind of took the two, my mother's academic side and my uncle's political side, and I kind of blended them together and became a political scientist. But I also spent a lot of time growing up in the South Pacific in the Kingdom of Tonga. My parents taught at a small university there that was founded by this man, Futahelu, and I got a very robust kind of education from a very young age in Pacific Island ways of thinking. And after that, I was sent to Lahainaluna High School. I was a boarder there. Lahainaluna has a lot of traditions. It is the alma mater of the first great Hawaiian scholar in modern times, David Malo, and it's the oldest school in Hawaii. So it's kind of some of my background. I went from there to college in California. I went to Harvard for a master's. I did my PhD at UH while teaching at Kamehameha Schools, where I teach Hawaiian history. So you might say that I'm a political scientist of Hawaii, and so this class is very much right up my alley. So that's just a very brief introduction of myself, this being the first video. So let's get right into the content of the reading. Just a little bit on that note, please know that when I read your responses, I'm going to want to see that you actually did the reading and not just drew from this video lecture. Just a quick note. I'm sure nobody's going to do that. So one of the first topics I cover in the reading is rail. Rail is pushing about $11 billion now in cost, and with that high price tag, you might want to ask yourself, what happened to the opposition towards rail? It's a pretty huge amount of money for a city to spend, the city and county of Honolulu. This is under the purview of the city council, and the opposition has gone back and forth. A lot of people don't remember there was a vote on rail, and the majority of people on Oahu did vote for rail, but then opposition seemed to ramp up, and as the costs started to escalate, opposition to rail was greater than support for rail. So what happened to that opposition? Some people who I know who have some inside information said that those inside players knew how to get the unions to work with the developers. And one thing about Hawaii is that whenever you have unions and developers agreeing, those things usually happen. And so that might have been the case with rail. Although there still is a small opposition out there, some of you may have seen the campaign posters for a candidate who has a big stop sign on her banners that say "Stop Rail." Now, anybody who's been out anywhere on the west side, past the airport, would know that rail is about 2/3 complete. So the idea of stopping rail now is kind of hard to imagine, but there is still the opposition out there. And so that candidate is running for lieutenant governor, and is one of the Republican candidates on that side. So rail is a very hot ticket item, especially on the city council level. Do you mind coming back for a second? Thank you. Second topic I go over is education. Some of you may remember, some of you may not remember, a few years ago we had something called Furlough Fridays, and that was during the Linda Lingle administration, so it was a while ago now. Furlough Fridays were a way to save the government money on the education budget by taking every other Friday off. And it was a very, very unpopular idea. People had to arrange childcare, and people were very afraid that test scores would go down. Amazingly, test scores went up. So that's why I say in the article that I think Governor Lingle will be probably forgiven for Furlough Fridays in the long term. A few years after that, with Governor Neil Abercrombie, the voters voted to give away the right to elect the Board of Education. And that was a very baffling thing to me. Why would people give up the right to choose their leaders, in this case the leaders of the education system? But they did that. And all the governors, Democrat and Republican, past and present, actually made the argument that that was the right thing to do. And so now there's an appointed Board of Education, and it's a little early to tell whether that's been an improvement or not. The picture here is of Amy Peruso, who I mentioned in the reading. She was a longtime teacher, but also was in the PhD program with me in political science, so is someone that I've known for a long time. But she recently was elected to the State House of Representatives representing Mililani and Wahiawa. Her sort of transition period was she got involved in the union. She became the treasurer of the HSTA, the Hawaii State Teachers Association. So this is one of the few progressive candidates who is victorious in this election. And her hope is that she can make a difference in the education system from that level, because she wasn't able to do it from the lower level of being a teacher or even in the union. So something to keep an eye out for. Incidentally, she won the Democratic nomination for State House for that district. She still has to run against the Republican candidate, but in most races, the vast majority of races, the Democratic nominee wins. And so that's the real race. Another thing mentioned, this was a few years ago now, 2014, the Department of Interior came to Hawaii, and they asked the question about basically federal recognition. Do Native Hawaiians want to change the rules within the Department of Interior to allow for a Native Hawaiian nation to be recognized? So this would be similar to a Native American nation within the continental U.S. So think about the Navajo Nation, Cherokees, the Lakota, and there's about 500 of these recognized nations actually. And Hawaiians would, if everybody was a member of this nation, they would actually be the largest at about 500,000 Hawaiians. So they came, about a panel of 5 people from the Department of Interior, and they asked the question and they allowed for oral testimony. And most of the respondents looked like this. They were very much against federal recognition. In other words, making Hawaiians into an Indian tribe. So there was the oral hearings, and I was at the Honolulu hearing at the state capitol, and it was about 98% in opposition to federal recognition. But then there were the written testimonies, and in those, it was about 65% in favor of federal recognition and 35% against. So it's hard to get a really good read on what is the Hawaiian sense of what Hawaiians want: federal recognition, or independence, or to keep everything the same. So that's an ongoing issue. Federal recognition has stalled somewhat under the Trump administration, and I can talk more about that at another lecture. So this has been a while ago now, 2014. Around the same time, you saw the beginning of the Mauna Kea protests, and a couple of activists kind of rose into prominence in these protests. If you don't know, Mauna Kea is one of the two very tall mountains on the Hawaii island, and there's already 10 or 11 telescopes up there, but this would be the 30-meter telescope. It would be by far the largest. It has a huge footprint on the summit of Mauna Kea, and protesters have many arguments about why that shouldn't be built. For one thing, Mauna Kea is considered to be a sacred mountain. That's the core argument, that they say it is. It's actually, the name is Mauna Kea, meaning the mountain of Wakea, the god who created. He's the progenitor of the Hawaiian race. And so there are other ways, other arguments for opposition, that the lease was no good, and that there was environmental impacts, and so there are many arguments against the telescope. On the other hand, there were arguments in favor of the telescope. The scientific community was very much in favor of it, including Hawaiian scientists, and obviously University of Hawaii was in favor of building the telescope. It was a land that they were subleasing from the state. Some of the activists who rose to prominence included Kaho'okahi Kanuha, who was Kamehameha graduate. He's a fairly young guy in his 20s, but pretty articulate, both in English and Hawaiian, in opposing the telescope. He was sort of mentored by an old activist from the Kaho'olave struggle. Kaho'olave is one of the Hawaiian islands which is used for military target practice, and that island was returned to the state and the bombing was stopped. Walter Riddy was one of the activists who got that bombing by the Navy to stop. The opposition on Mauna Kea spread to Haleakala. There was a telescope they were trying to build on Haleakala, and this is a picture here of Kaleikoa Ka'eo. And he opposed both telescopes and led the opposition to the telescope on Haleakala. Now, incidentally, when he went to court for being arrested on Haleakala, he only spoke Hawaiian in court. And if you don't know, the state of Hawaii has two official languages, English and Hawaiian language. So technically he should have been allowed to speak Hawaiian in court, but he was simply not recognized by the judge as even being there. He was held in contempt of court. This caused a big uproar in the media, and that judgment was overturned. So Mauna Kea, again, like the other struggles, has been an ongoing back and forth. Small victories, sometimes on one side or the other. On a more positive note, in 2017, I believe, it was the end of the Malama Honua voyage, the Hawaiian voyaging canoe Hokule'a sailed, circumnavigated the Earth without any instruments, using the stars and swells alone. This is pretty well known, but here you have roughly the route, and it was a 3-year journey, and they returned to a huge fanfare. I was at the return at Ala Moana Beach Park, Magic Island, and there were many, many thousands of people there. and this has drawn worldwide attention. So it's been kind of unlike some of the other struggles where it's very, very contentious. This has been considered to be overall positive. And really the motive of this voyage is to think about this phrase of Malama Honua, to care for Earth. They're saying we can do these kind of things in a sustainable way to think about sustainability across the globe. So look for more voyages and more of that kind of emphasis from Hokulea and other voyaging canoes, which there are about 7 or 8 now around the Pacific coming up in the near future. On the other more negative side, there was a section in the reading where I talked about cost of living. Cost of living is an ongoing struggle, which many of you are very aware of. I don't know how many of you are aware that over the summer, the average house, I believe that it was in either May or June, reached $1 million, the average price of a house, during that month. And then I think in July it went down to 945,000 or something like that. It's just really, really, really skyrocketed. And the state has tried to take some measures to deal with this. One of them is Kahawiki Village. If you've been to the airport recently, you notice a village of these houses. They are actually hurricane shelter houses where they house people after natural disasters. They go up quickly, they're relatively cheap, and it's actually on its own grid. So those are rental units for people who are formerly homeless, and the developer, who is actually a private developer, said that if we had 5 of these villages, we could end homelessness on Oahu for the most part. So negative and positive there, depending how you look at it. And finally, one of the issues that only came at the most recently was the false missile alarm. Most of us on January 13th got this message that said ballistic missile threat inbound. This is not a test. And I remember that morning very well, and we kind of sheltered with our kids, and then 38 minutes later we got the message that there is no missile threat. Now, this mistake was capitalized by the gubernatorial candidate Colleen Hanabusa. And Hanabusa, on the day of the missile alarm, talked about how her husband was driving 100 miles an hour on the freeway, trying to get to his family, and then in her commercials she had this somebody typing in a wrong Twitter password over and over again. She said, this 38 minutes should have been 3 minutes, because in 3 minutes Governor David Ige knew that the missile alarm was false, and he couldn't update people because he couldn't remember his Twitter password. So that argument and the animosity towards Ige put Hanabusa in the lead for several months, but right as the election was approaching, that lead diminished, and the polls seemed to switch in the favor of David Ige, and he won by a reasonably high margin, considering on election day, which was August 9th. So in terms of politics, I couldn't go in a PowerPoint over all the different candidates, but there weren't that many races that where the person who was expected to win didn't win. One of those that was a little bit of surprise was the lieutenant governor. Dr. Josh Green won pretty well over about 5 other candidates. And one of the reasons for that was that he got money from what's called a super PAC. A super PAC is a political action committee, you might say, on steroids. So political action committees are ways to bundle contributions that are much, much, much larger than an individual can give to a candidate. There are limits on how much you can give. to political candidates. So the super PAC, which was called Be Change Now, which is sponsored by the Carpenters Union, gave $1 million, poured $1 million into Josh Green's race, and most political pundits agree that was the reason why he won. I talked about a couple of other races again, but I think the influence of these large amounts of money in politics is one of the big stories that kind of will underlie politics as we look back into the recent past, like the last 4 years, and look into the near future. That PAC, Be Change Now, used to be called Pacific Resources Partnership. They tried to change their name to All Hawaii Stand Together, but that name there is a song by the songwriter Liko Martin, and he threatened to sue them, so they changed it to Be Change Now, which is sort of like based on a saying by Mahatma Gandhi. So that's a very, very quick overview of this week's reading. I don't usually do PowerPoints like this on current events, so this is a little bit unusual. In the future, there'll be more issue-based, just like the chapters in our book. If you haven't picked up the book, by the way, the name is The Value of Hawaii. The authors are Craig Howes and John Osorio. And if I've heard the Windward Community College bookstore is out of it, you can get the book at Barnes & Noble in Ala Moana, or the store called Namea Hawaii, also known as Native Books, in Ward Center. So I hope everybody's able to do that. In the meantime, the reading for this week is online, and it goes over what we just covered and more. So until next week, I'll see you guys then, and have a good week.